He's a regular guest on the show and a very popular one at that. Brian Berletic, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I posed the question on the poll because Tucker Carlson was very clear that there will be a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States. I myself am equally persuaded that there will be. But as you may have just heard, only about a quarter of the public think that that is a serious proposition. You're a man who knows this game. What's your view?
Maybe a lot of people are voting because they don't even want to imagine that such a thing is possible. And I think in Moscow and hopefully in Washington and in London, there are at least some people who feel similar to that. They do not want to see a nuclear exchange. They know it'll be catastrophic for everyone on all sides. Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. They're constantly upgrading it. They have brand new intercontinental ballistic missiles that just came into service. They're preparing this because they do understand the gravity of the threats. This is a proxy war being waged against them by the US, by the rest of NATO, and they understand the real danger that it poses to them. It is an existential threat to Russia. So they're taking it very seriously. Also, we see a history in the West of them being unable to accept defeat, being unable to reverse gear, but also now they're unable to succeed on the battlefields, proxy and directly. So it's a very, very dangerous situation. And I believe that there is a possibility. However small, there is a possibility. It only has to happen one time. There only has to be one miscalculation for this to go catastrophic.
Well, their multi-warhead Sarmad missile is now on duty, on active duty. This is a rocket that, if fired from Kaliningrad, will destroy London, Birmingham, Manchester, in Glasgow, at least in an instant, and will be here in around 7 minutes from Kaliningrad. And I'm sure that Americans and others, French people, German people, have an idea what their main targets would be at the hands of the same rocket. The Russians are not deploying this for a laugh. They have not put this on active duty for a laugh because, Brian, you know this very well, when you're fighting a war thousands of miles away in somebody else's country, that's not an existential matter for you. But if you are fighting a war literally on your own doorstep and increasingly inside your own country, that is an existential matter. And therefore, there are no holds barred. There wouldn't be for any nuclear-armed country threatened with destruction, dismemberment, and ruin, would there?
Absolutely. And I think the problem that we see is policymakers in Washington are so used to waging war so far abroad. And even this proxy war they're waging against Russia and Ukraine, this for the West is not existential. This might be existential for the existence of NATO, but this is an organization that does not need to exist. It has not needed to exist for decades. It's questionable whether it ever needed to exist. And so the stakes are completely different for the West as they are for Russia. And the West has a very bad habit, and they've done this all throughout this confrontation with Russia before this current conflict began, and all throughout this current conflict, underestimating Russian resolve. They seem surprised that Russia went into Ukraine in the first place. They seem surprised that the defenses in the south, in Zaporozhye, are so formidable that Russian people are standing and fighting and defeating these NATO-trained in arms Ukrainian forces that were supposed to roll right over Russian defenses. So this is a big problem when you have policymakers who have constantly underestimated Russia, who cannot seem to get into the head of policymakers in Moscow and understand how serious it is to them from their point of view. This is the making of an error in judgment, a miscalculation that could lead to something catastrophic.
And many people on the left and the right, inside the military, in diplomatic circles and out of it, have been warning about this for a very long time. These miscalculations surely began with the Gorbachev, Bush Senior agreements and the assurances that were given to Gorbachev that if the then Soviet Union did not oppose the coming down of the wall, the reunification of Germany, the withdrawal of Russian forces from Germany, that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the word that Secretary James Baker actually said. We know that because he wrote it in his own memoirs. They also completely failed to hear Putin's Munich speech in 2008, when again he spelt out all of the consequences that might flow from the expansion of NATO and its inexorable drive to the east. Are we led by fools or knaves, Brian?
Sometimes it's very hard to tell the difference, and that's absolutely true. That is a very good point. A lot of people should keep that in mind, that NATO has constantly expanded east, even after the Cold War was over, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This entire conflict in Ukraine is about NATO expansion eastward. And it goes beyond just mere expansion. It's the way that it is expanding. The West poses as if these nations chose to join NATO, when in reality, these were regime change operations, the installation of a client regime that would then join NATO, even if it contradicted that nation's best interests, which, say, in Ukraine's case is absolutely true. Georgia, the government was overthrown in 2003. Then the US and NATO armed it. And then Georgian forces attacked Russian forces in 2008. Imagine that happening again in Ukraine, but on a much larger scale. This is the threat that Russia was reacting to. The fact that people in Washington seem surprised that Russia took it so seriously, that is very scary. And we have to wonder, and I think we should be worried that they're going to make the same type of miscalculation, go through the same mental process when it comes to nuclear weapons. We even see in the media, the Western media, many themes surrounding the idea that Russia, their red lines mean nothing. We don't have to worry about them. We can cross them. Russia won't do anything. But again, it only takes pushing that button one time, and everything will be over.
Let me ask you a question, Brian, that tantalizes me. I alluded to it in my introduction. When we hear from people like you, military men who've been on the inside, Larry Johnson, Scott Ritter, Colonel McGregor, and so on, we hear a very different perspective to that which the politicians in charge of the military, at least nominally, are the breeze that they are constantly shooting. Is there a tension between the people who actually have to do the fighting and dying until it becomes nuclear, in which case we all die and nobody fights? I'm just wondering if you fellows are somehow an aberration, or whether there exists inside the military, intelligence, security apparatus, serious misgivings about the road that the politicians are taking us down.
I think, fortunately, that there are people on the inside who understand all of this. After all, a lot of my analysis surrounding the conflict in Ukraine You and I have talked before the offensive was ever launched. We talked about how it would be a failure. How did we know this? How did I know this? I was reading through the Western media, and in between the propaganda, you do see the actual facts that all added up to this upcoming offensive being a catastrophic failure. And so that means that there are people there collecting actual facts, and they are in place. The problem is that a lot of people who do understand how this all really works, they're not allowed to put that together into a report that says, no, the offensive is impossible. This whole project is impossible. You should stop now before you squander any more life or move us closer to nuclear annihilation. They're not allowed to do that for political reasons. And that is the problem. There's a political agenda disconnected from reality. And I think the further forward that it goes, the further away from reality it gets. And that is so dangerous, and especially because of this point you're bringing up tonight about the potential for nuclear conflict.
Now, the truth is, the commander-in-chief, not just of American forces, but effectively all of America's allies, is a few sandwiches short of a picnic. He is unlikely to thrill the troops, and increasingly as he goes around the US, he's greeted by a chorus of abuse, some of it very vulgar indeed. But the situation is still that if he gave the order, it would be carried out. Anybody feeling safer going to bed tonight that if Joe Biden orders events that will ineluctably lead to a nuclear war, that everyone will carry out their duty, salute and say, yes, sir?
Well, some people might suspect that U.S. President Joe Biden is not actually really in charge of anything. He's not even apparently in charge of his own faculties. But then does that make it any better? Because then we don't actually know who really is in charge or who really would make that call. And it is a frightening prospect if the decision was made. I believe that people further down the chain of command would carry out their orders. That is how everything is set up to operate. They don't really have the ability to question it or to protest it. And so what we have to really hope, we ourselves have to make noise about this, but what we have to hope is that there are people on the inside talking about this and trying to steer things away before it even comes to that decision. The conflict in Ukraine has been a disaster for the West. I see some signs that seem to indicate that they are contemplating perhaps an exit ramp other than nuclear annihilation. So I mean, we have to hope, because otherwise there really is nothing that we can do if they press forward, and that is their ultimate determination is nuclear annihilation.